1st of March, 1946. Mr. Arthur Osborne asks, Bhagavan, last evening, Nuna, his daughter, 4 years old, told us, Dr. Syed is my best friend in the world. And thereupon we asked her, what about Bhagavan? And she replied, Bhagavan is not in the world. Bhagavan was surprised at this remark of the child, and involuntarily his finger rose to his nose, and holding it there, he said, What a sage remark for a child to make! Even great men cannot understand what that remark means. They ought to have asked her, where else is Bhagavan, if not in the world? And at this, Mr. Osborne said, Yes, we did ask her. And she said, Bhagavan is out of the world. Dr. Syed then asked Bhagavan, Does not total or complete surrender require that one should not have left in him the desire even for liberation or God? Complete surrender does require that you have no desire of your own, that God's desire alone is your desire, and that you have no desire of your own. Now that I am satisfied on that point, I want to know what are the steps by which I could achieve this deep surrender. There are two ways. One is looking into the source of I and merging into that source. The other is feeling I am helpless by myself. God alone is all-powerful, and throwing myself completely on Him is the only means of safety for me. And thus gradually developing the conviction that God alone exists and the ego does not. Both methods lead to the same goal. Complete surrender is another name for jnana, or mukti, liberation. March 1946. A visitor quoted verse 33, chapter 3 in the Bhagavad Gita, and then asked Bhagavan, Are we then to do nothing and simply allow the senses to go their own way? It only means actions will go on according to the gunas of the man. They cannot be prevented, but that is the very reason why man should acquire jnana and thus become unaffected by the consequences of such action. The verse says, acquire jnana and be unattached to the actions and their consequences. Let us see in what connection this verse occurs. Then I remembered that once before I asked Bhagavan about this very same verse, and then Bhagavan pointed out to me the very next verse in which we are directed not to yield to the senses. I mentioned this for the guidance of the visitor. Bhagavan had told me then that if the two verses were taken together, it could not be contended that the Gita teaches don't restrain or attempt to restrain the senses, because what does restraint avail? May 1946. In an answer to a visitor, Bhagavan said, Find out to whom is viyoga, That is true yoga. Yoga is common to all paths. Yoga is really nothing but ceasing to think that you are different from the self or reality. All the yogas, karma, jnana, bhakti, and raja, are just different paths to suit different natures with different modes of evolution, and to get them out of the long cherished notion that they are different from the self. There is no question of union or yoga in the sense of going and joining something that is somewhere away from us or different from us, because you never were or could be separate from the self. In the afternoon, I showed Bhagavan the passage in the Sunday Times where Mr. Mahadevan, in his radio show, quotes Sri Shankara's reference to his own experience as proof of the existence of Jivan Mukta, and about the controversies concerning various kinds of mukti. He read out passages from a Tamil book called The Truth of Advaita, in which all doubts about the state of the Jivan Mukta are raised and answered. And then he said, various illustrations are given in books to enable us to understand how the jnani can live and act without the mind, although living and acting require the use of the mind. The potter's wheel goes on turning round even after the potter has ceased to turn it, because the pot is finished. In the same way, the electric fan goes on revolving for some minutes after we switch off the current. The prarabdha which created the body will make it go through whatever activities it was meant for. But the jnani goes through all these activities without the notion that he is the doer of them. It is hard to understand how this is possible. The illustration generally given is that the jnani performs actions in some such way as a child that is roused from sleep to eat, and then eats, but does not remember the next morning that it ate. It has to be remembered that all these explanations are not for the jnani. He knows and has no doubts. He knows that he is not the body and is not doing anything, even though his body may be engaged in some activity. These explanations are for the onlookers who think of the jnani as one with a body and cannot help identifying him with his body. There are various controversies or schools of thought as to whether a jnani can continue to live in his physical body after realization. Some hold that one who dies cannot be a jnani because his body must vanish into air or some such thing. They put forward all sorts of funny notions. If a man must at once leave his body when he realizes the self, I wonder how any knowledge of the self or the state of realization can come down to other men. And that would mean that all those who have given us the fruits of their self-realization in books cannot be considered jnanis because they went on living after realization. And if it is held that a man cannot be considered a jnani so long as he performs actions in the world, and action is impossible without the mind, then not only the great sages who carried on various kinds of work after attaining jnana must then not be considered jnanis, but even the gods also, and Ishvara himself, since he continues looking after the world. The fact is that any amount of action can be performed, and performed quite well, by the yoni without his identifying himself with it in any way or ever imagining that he is the doer. Some power acts through his body and uses his body to get the work done, was the essence of that show. Bhagavan has said the same on previous occasions also. And he continued to speak about mukti and said, "Mukti is not anything to be attained. It is our real nature. We are always that. It is only so long as one feels that he is in bondage that he has to try to get released from bondage. When a man feels that he is in bondage, he tries to find out for whom is the bondage, and by that inquiry discovers that there is no bondage for him, but only for the mind, and that the mind itself disappears or proves non-existent when turned inwards instead of outward turned towards the sense objects. It then merges into its source, the self, and the mind ceases to exist as a separate entity. In that state, there is no feeling either of bondage or liberation. So long as one speaks of mukti, he is not free from the sense of bondage. The visitor who had asked about yoga in the morning session now pursued his questions further. I did not quite grasp all that Bhagavan said this morning. What am I to do when the mind strays in various directions during meditation? Simply draw the mind back each time it strays and fix it in meditation. There is no other way. Bhagavan then quoted chapter 6, verse 26 from the Bhagavad Gita, which said the same. And the visitor asked, then is there no use in pranayama, breath control? Should I not practice it? Pranayama is also a help. It is one of the various methods that are intended to help us attain one-pointedness of mind. Pranayama can also help to control the wandering mind and attain this one-pointedness, and therefore it can be used. But one should not stop there. After obtaining control of the mind through pranayama, one should not rest content with any experiences which may accrue therefrom, but should harness the controlled mind to the question, who am I? Till the mind merges in the self. The visitor further asked about meditation and the use of images of God and mantras. Yes, of course, all these things can help. Or why should they be recommended in the books? Various things are prescribed to suit various natures. Each person must choose what seems easiest and appeals to him most.